Hello everyone and welcome to the Mental Health Commission of Canada's webinar series on mental health for first responders. My name is Samuel Bro and I am a program manager with Prevention and Promotion Initiatives at the Mental Health Commission of Canada. It's truly a pleasure for us to be here with you today for the second webinar in a new series that we have launched to focus specifically on sharing information, resources, and strategies on mental health specifically for first responders. Today's webinar topic is psychological health, safety, trauma, and resilience in the workplace. And I have the pleasure of introducing today's webinar speaker. But just before we get started, let's review a few housekeeping items. And so I invite you to send any questions or comments using the chat feature, which can be found on the right of your screen. If you don't see the chat feature, look for the icon on the upper right-hand corner of your screen that says chat. It looks like a little bubble, and then you click on that, and then a chat window should appear for you on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint slides. We encourage you, when you are sending your questions, if you could please use the drop-down menu and select all panelists, so questions go to myself as well as the presenter, and I will ask the questions on your behalf during a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Please note that the presenter will deliver their presentation. We will monitor questions during the presentation and create a list that we will use during question and answer period at the end. This webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted on the Commission's website in the webinar archives section following the presentation in about 2 to 3 weeks. While this webinar session is being delivered in English, we do plan to deliver a French webinar session in November, so please do feel free to stand by for that. Also, due to the large number of participants today, we have muted all of your phone lines just to eliminate any background noise. And then, of course, we do invite you to take out the time to fill out the survey questionnaire when you leave the webinar session. You'll be prompted to answer a very short questionnaire that will help us make sure that we meet your needs and continue to deliver high-quality products. And finally, today's discussion and presentation could trigger certain uncomfortable feelings and thoughts. While we are coming together today as a community of over 300 individuals across Canada, you may be participating in this conversation alone in your office or at home. And with this in mind, our webinar sessions are designed to be safe and inclusive spaces. So if you do feel that this conversation is leaving you unsettled, please reach out to a friend, a family member, colleague, or peer supporter to debrief. And of course, if you are in crisis, please call the nearest distress center if it is an emergency, call 911, or go to your local emergency department. Should you have any specific safety concerns that should be addressed during the presentation, please message me directly as the host. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Jeff Morley, who is a registered psychologist and board-certified expert in traumatic stress. Dr. Morley recently retired as a staff surgeon with the RCMP after 23 years of service. In his practice, Jeff now works with many first responders as well as people in the community. His practice is largely centered on helping people with PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other operational stress injuries. Jeff has trained as first responders across Canada on critical incident stress management, peer support, psychologically healthy workplaces, trauma, and resilience. And so today during the webinar, Jeff will touch briefly on Canada's new National Psychological Health and Safety Standard in the Workplace, which has been launched back in 2013. He'll then focus on risks to workplace psychological health and safety, including trauma, compassion fatigue, organizational stress, and others. And then Jeff will conclude on the latest science, research, and best practices for personal and professional resilience. So Jeff will deliver the presentation, and then we'll follow with a short question and answer period during the last 25 minutes of the presentation. So I'll pass over the ball to Jeff, and over to you, Jeff, to present this wonderful presentation today.
Thanks, Samuel. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. So this is only the second webinar that I've ever done, so hopefully all goes well and smoothly with the technology, and also just listening to your kind of gentle warning if you're triggered or things like that along the way. So I think it's great to do that, and I hope I'm not going to say anything that's going to be too anxiety-provoking for any of you today, but I will be mindful of that. And I will get us started by framing today in terms of the bigger picture around psychologically healthy workplaces and then trauma and resilience. And how I like to begin the conversation is just by acknowledging that Canada is the first and only country that I'm aware of to have a national psychologically healthy workplace standard. It's a new standard, as noted, developed in 2013 with the Mental Health Commission of Canada and the Canadian Standards Association. It's a voluntary standard at this point in that organizations are not required to officially adopt the standard, though we're expecting soon through case law and different programs like that the standard is going to become a de facto legal standard. So some organizations like the RCMP, and I know the BC Nurses Union and several other organizations have now begun to officially adopt the standard. And I'll just touch on it quickly to say that the standard says that the vision for a psychologically healthy and safe workplace is one that actively works to prevent harm to workers' psychological health, including in negligent, reckless, or intentional ways, and promotes psychological well-being. So what I like about the standard is the focus on being active, it's the focus on prevention and promoting psychological well-being in the workplace. And just quickly, went too fast there, around some of that. So what I like to acknowledge is that I think with first responders and in our communities, we have the same threats to our psychological health and well-being in the workplace as people working at, Bell Canada or at Safeway. I think we have some additional threats to our psychological well-being at work, and I'm going to frame those today in terms of three things. What I'm going to call primary trauma, when we're the one that's in harm's way. We'll talk about secondary trauma, the experience of confronting unfixable suffering. And I want to just acknowledge the impact of organizational stress, which I'm going to have a little less time to talk about today. But it's very interesting, especially in my experience working with first responders, the impact of the organizational stress cannot be understated. I find so many first responders are working through, whether it's a primary traumatic event, the cumulative buildup of the secondary trauma, but then it comes to a conflict in the workplace or an investigation process or some organizational dynamic that's really causing them stress. And I can't underestimate the impact that has. It's often sort of the straw that broke the camel's back in my experience. It was funny, some time ago I'd had a first responder come into my office that had been involved in a shooting many years ago. So when he came in, I presumed that he was there to talk about that horribly traumatic experience. And when he sat down, I said that, I presume you're here to talk about that. And he said, no, actually, that was really difficult, but I kind of made peace with that. And I said, oh, what's bringing you in? We've got this new boss. He's changing all the rules. He's not communicating with us. There's conflict in the team. So, those organizational stressors are often some of the biggest ones that go on for many, many first responders. So we'll just acknowledge that. And as I carry on here, I do want to shift our focus and spend a bit of time talking about some of the traumatic threats to first responders out there doing their job. And it's interesting that the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders, would say that for an event to be considered traumatic, it needs to involve a serious threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others close by, and for the event to be considered traumatic, it needs to involve fear, helplessness, or horror. So those are important words: fear, helplessness, or horror. And I think it's interesting in our work sometimes what gets considered traumatic and what doesn't. So I remember as a young RCMP officer, I joined the force out of Ontario. I was on the job 4 or 5 months, and my parents wanted to fly out from Ontario, check up on me, see how I was doing in this new job. They were coming in the evening, and it just so happens that that day shift was my very first high-speed chase, good long high-speed chase down number 1 road in Richmond. That was followed by a car crash. That was followed by a foot chase, and that was followed by a fist fight. I remember coming home at the end of the day and telling my parents about the event, and as I'm talking, my mom sort of leans over and puts her hand on me and says, "Oh, are you okay? Are you okay?" And I remember thinking to myself, am I okay? I was like, this is what I joined for. I personally thought it was one of the best days on the job so far. But I think about our definition, though. Primary trauma. Did that event involve a serious threat to my physical integrity? Could I have been injured or killed in something like that? Yes, I think it did. Did that event involve fear, helplessness, or horror for me? I don't think so much. I hope on that day at least most of that was experienced by the bad guy. I think there's other things that can go on the job that sometimes have a lot less drama, lights, and sirens that can be very disturbing. I remember taking a call, domestic in progress. Dispatcher says, being called in by a 9-year-old boy, please don't say who's calling it in. So we show up, and the dad's there, and he's this big, heavy-set guy, short red hair, all tattooed up, angry guy. And we did absolutely everything we could to try and arrest this guy. No physical evidence. Wife wouldn't say anything. We're unable to make arrests. But I remember as we were clearing the call, standing in the driveway, and that dad just sort of clenched up, looking over, saying, "Who called this in? Who called this in?" And I said, "The neighbor, someone in the neighborhood did, sir. Half the neighborhood heard what was going on." But I remember that dad just staring over at his kid. And you know exactly what was going to happen as soon as we left there. So sense of fear for that kid, sense of helplessness to be able to protect them, absolutely. Any big critical incident, stress debriefing, or things like that, not a chance. Just one of those things that we come across in the course of our lives and our careers that I think can start to take a toll on us over time. But I want to spend a few more minutes and talk in a bit more depth about what goes on when the fight's on or the threat's happening, those primary trauma moments. So whether that's the fist flying, the bullets flying, or off work, you know, the car spinning towards the pole or the bears charging down the path at us. So those moments when we are imminently in harm's way. And I'm going to make the case to you that there's 5 reactions that all people have, and in fact all animals have, to survive threat or trauma. And, well, sometimes we have some choice in how we respond. Okay, someone's having a moment over here, let's get our team together and go and do our thing. That there's other times when the fists are flying or our lives in danger, I'm going to make the case that we're going to do what we're going to do, and we might be surprised. That in those cases of extreme or urgent threat, that our reactions are instinctual and that they're involuntary. And those are really important concepts to understand as we try and reduce stigma around mental health and trauma, is to appreciate the involuntary nature of our reactions both in the moment and, as we'll talk about a bit later, our symptoms sometimes after the fact. So it's challenging for me to do a webinar like this because usually when I present on these topics, I'm much and ask people to contribute along the way. But I'll start with the fight. Let's talk a bit about the fight. So my question is, what goes on when the fight's on, the bear's charging down the path, or the car spinning to the pole? What's those physical reactions, those physiological reactions that go on in the body? So as I get people talking about this, usually the first comment is adrenaline, Right. So what happens when we get a big shot of adrenaline in our system? So our heart rate, boom, 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 boom. Our heart goes up, blood pressure goes up. Breathing, what happens to breathing? It goes rapid and shallow. So if people do rapid, shallow breathing for any length of time, what can that result in? People may pass out. And again, could be shame, stigma, embarrassment, but this is just one of the body's natural reactions if it does any period of extended shallow breathing. So we've got the heart rate, we've got the breathing, and then in addition, the adrenaline gives us a great deal of strength, both strength and speed. So, you know, those stories of the little old lady lifting the car off the trapped kid, these are not just National Enquirer stories. These sorts of things really do happen. We may be surprised how strong we get, how fast we get. Other things that go on in the body, I often ask people, where does the blood flow go in the body when the fight's on? So often I get a response, oh, it flows to the core, it flows to the core. And in fact, the blood does flow to the heart and lungs, but it actually flows away from core, especially things like digestion, to arms, legs, quads, biceps, fight or flight. So it gives us a great deal of speed and strength, and things like digestion shut down. So what can that cause when it occurs? And I'm trying to be politically correct here, but I usually say people sometimes may pee their pants or their bowels may evacuate. I had a big burly corrections officer in one of my workshops say, sometimes people may defecate. I thought, yeah, that's good, very politically correct. But it's another good example where people may feel shame, stigma, embarrassment, you know, if something like that happened. But important to remember, it's a normal, involuntary, physiological reaction. So bowels may let go. People may throw up. I sadly ran across a car accident a few weeks ago. Young fella got T-boned pretty good in the intersection. He was okay, but he had thrown up all over himself. And again, just normal thing that the body does to survive. You know, it says, I don't need to be digesting lunch right now. I need to be fighting or fleeing. So lots there in the body. The other thing to acknowledge that happens is not just the adrenaline, but what happens to our pain tolerance when the fight's on? It goes up. Pain tolerance goes way up. So we have all the adrenaline, but also the endorphins. And the reason it's important to talk about this is that, you know, maybe after a traumatic events occurred, it's always good to ask someone that's been involved, you know, are you okay? But, you know, important to appreciate, they may not even realize that they've been hurt. You know, oh, yeah, I'm fine, I'm fine. Oh, are you aware there's blood pouring out of the side of your head? Oh, no, I wasn't, because of all those endorphins. So good to ask, but you may need to respectfully check or have them get checked out to make sure that they're okay. Other things in the body that go on, what goes on with our hands, often it's shaking. Our hands we shake like a leaf. I don't know if there's any nurses on the line, but I do a lot of work with nurses, so I always think, hey, if you've just gone through something really traumatic, now's not the time to give me an IV. But I know with the nurses, sometimes they have no choice. But yeah, we shake, and I know personally that's one of the reactions that I hate the most. I think a lot of people do. But I've since learned that it's a very functional thing that the body does, and in fact, it's one of the ways that the body discharges a lot of the adrenaline that's in the system. You know, so I've had people say, well, how do I get rid of the shaking? How do I get rid of the shaking? And sort of paradoxically, the way to get rid of it is to exaggerate it, to consciously shake it out, shake out your hands, shake out your legs, do whatever you can in order to sort of reset the body's neural circuitry and burn some of that adrenaline off. I was watching a video when they were training us on this, and it was a video of a young gazelle that had been set upon by a constrictor, by a big snake. And I guess unlike the videographers are supposed to do and let nature play itself out. They couldn't bear to watch it, so they unwound the snake from this little gazelle. They kept the camera on the gazelle. It hopped away from the snake around a rock, stood there for about 30 seconds, shook, 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 and then it went back and joined the herd and started eating. So that's where we get that saying, shake it off, shake it off. It's quite an accurate saying, shake it off. I think it's like a Britney Spears song now, or Taylor Swift. My daughter would correct me, Taylor Swift. But it's an accurate saying. So don't fight the shakes. Go somewhere private if you need to. Shake it out, a really good way to cope. And then as we work our way sort of up the body to talk about the senses, what goes on, for example, with our vision? And that's where we have the phenomenon known as tunnel vision. For those that have had that experience, it's a good example of the involuntary things that the body does, where the vision locks on and we get very precisely focused on the threat. So sometimes that may be the person, sometimes it may be a weapon, or maybe it's the tooth or the claw or whatever the threat is. And we cannot see what else is going on around us. It was interesting as a young police officer, I remember getting a call of an armed robbery at a bank. And we weren't far away, so I, just around the corner, I got out of the car, ran into the bank, talked to the teller. Can you describe the suspect? No, but the gun was silver with black handles. Was he tall or short or dark or light? I don't know, but there was little green dots right on the end of the gun. She practically could have read us the serial number of the sidearm and had no clue who was holding it. And it's not because she's a bad bank teller or inexperienced. It's because that's what the tunnel vision does to us. And again, the reason it's important to talk about this is that, sometimes after the fact when we're debriefing an event or someone's describing what they did, or, hey, didn't you see us over there waving at you or signaling you? No, I didn't. Well, who else was there? I have no idea who else was there. So again, it's not because we're bad workers or responders. It's because that's what the body does. So really important to normalize that. So we get the tunnel vision, and then what goes on with our hearing? The key thing with the hearing is something that's called auditory exclusion. So the odd time our hearing can get very precise, but more often than not, hearing actually shuts down. It's interesting, even when we're talking about very traumatic events like police shootings. I know there's many more than police on the line, but it's just a good example because I was just reading something recently how very often the memory of the event, even with loud guns going off, there's no auditory attached to it. So hearing can shut down. So it's another good example when we're debriefing something, or we've gone through something, or someone's describing a traumatic event. And didn't you hear us calling you on the radio? Didn't you hear us yelling at you or telling you what to do? No, I didn't. And again, not because I'm a bad worker. That's just my hearing was gone and I had no clue what was going on hearing-wise. So we got our vision, we got our hearing, and then the other thing that hits us is our ability to speak. So our ability to use language. This is another area that I'll talk about, how we're learning so much more about how trauma affects the brain and the body from the latest in neuroscience. But PET scans and fMRIs are really showing us how one of the areas in the brain that actually shuts down during a traumatic event is Broca's region, the area of the brain that has to do with speech and language. So very often in the heat of the moment, people are unable to speak. There are no words. When we're in survival mode, language physically in the gray area of our brain goes offline. So very often our words are broken, stuttered, or there's no words at all. Funny example of this for me was with my brother. Back in our early 20s, he was in the Army. He just took the Airborne Commando jump course just before the Airborne shut down. And he came home for Christmas to my parents' house, and he wanted to take his motorcycle in from outside in Ontario, put it in the basement to clean it and store it for the winter. So he, when my mom was out of the house, we drove the bike through the family room down into the basement. He took the gas tank off the bike to clean the bike. I was upstairs, and the next thing I heard was a huge explosion. I thought it was a dump truck crash outside or something, but next thing I know, my Army tough guy brother comes running up from the basement. Fire! 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 And this high-pitched little girl voice is all that he could muster, right? Not to Jeff, been an explosion, better call 911, right? So his Broca's region was offline or hampered with that. So we got vision, hearing, speech, and then also with emotions. This is also important to talk about because very often people may be embarrassed or even mortified by the emotions that come out of them in a traumatic event. And what's the key big emotion that comes out with fight? Anger. Certainly fear and shock, and sometimes after the fact, sadness. But it's funny, even with first responders, when I ask this in a group, often it takes a while for anger to come out. Because even if you're a tough soldier, firefighter, social worker, whatever you are, none of us really likes to feel anger. But it's very important to appreciate that it is a survival emotion. You know, when the fight's on and we need to do that, having that anger or even rage to stay alive can be very, very purposeful. But, you know, good examples of this where we may be mortified either that we raged or got angry or cried or whatever we did at a traumatic event. I remember this lovely young woman came into my office some time ago, not a first responder, a young gal in the community, and she was a real hippie, a true hippie, had the flowered skirt and the peace symbol and the long braided hair and vegetarian, vegan, all that kind of stuff. And what brought her in was that she was out walking her little dog. It was a young, like a Yorkie or a Shih Tzu, and it had got attacked by this, the Don Cherry bull terrier. And it's funny, as she's describing this to me, she says what she remembers is, one, seeing the bite, a gap, and next thing she remembers, she put her hands out in front of her and released them, is letting go. That this young, peace-loving hippie gal had choked the bull terrier to death. She'd killed this dog. I was personally quite impressed at how she handled it. She was mortified that she'd, you know, she said, I would never hurt, what was her language? I would never harm another sentient being. So for her, this sort of anger or rage or instinct that came out of her really, really deeply upset her. So important to appreciate sometimes the emotions that can come up, whether it's the anger, fear, sadness, or even sometimes, which may surprise people, is, you know, one of the emotional reactions that can hit us is a sense of, I call it a Zen-like calmness, that even in the heat of the moment, we may be surprised how calm and clear we are. Some people think, oh, if that ever happened to me, I would freak out, or I don't know what I'd do. And you might be surprised. Often our sound goes offline, our speech goes offline, and we go into sort of an autopilot, Zen-like calm reaction mode. So that, too, may surprise us as we go along. And the last thing I want to touch on with the fight is our sense of time. What happens to our sense of time? Time actually often slows down. So if we're there waiting for help to arrive, it may be a minute and it feels like a half an hour. But there's also an experience where things can appear to happen in slow motion. The phenomenon known as visual slowdown effect. For me, I've had it twice. It's both in car accidents. When I ask other people about it, often it's car accidents or falls or things like that. And I was just, again, this weekend reading an interesting article on police shootings, and they said that two of the biggest reported phenomenon in a shooting situation is both the auditory exclusion and the visual slowdown, a distorted sense of time. So really important to normalize that. But again, sometimes when we're giving our statement after the fact or describing what's gone on, that sense of time can be skewed. I had a sad but sort of curious example of this some time ago when this lovely senior citizen came into my office, older fella and well into his late 60s, and he'd been walking in a crosswalk. He got smoked by a car and flown about 60 feet in the air, and he describes the event as he remembers being midair, sort of looking down and just thinking to himself, oh, I really hope there's a nice patch of grass for me to land on. So had the full slowdown and certainly that sense of surprising calm, cool, all business kind of as he's going through that. Certainly caught up with him later with his reactions, but sort of a normal reaction in the heat of the moment like that. So lots of reactions there with the fight. And then I'd say, what goes on there with the flight? And the short version there is physiologically, the same thing goes on in the body, all those same reactions. What's different? Basically the direction of travel. I'm either going to the threat or I'm going away from the threat with all the energy that I can muster. And it's a good example how the flight too, as all these reactions are involuntary. So often we feel that shame or stigma if we, in our world, first responders, basically, if you go to anywhere but fight, you flight, freeze, give up, like stigma, shame, embarrassment, right? Because it's just valued around the fight reaction. But important to remember that all 5 of these are ways that we stay alive. So with the flight, I remember chasing a bad guy over a series of backyard fences one evening, sort of paralleling him through these fences, but as I'm midair coming down, what do I see there but a great big pit bull with a spiked collar. My immediate reaction, I bounced like a kangaroo in one bounce right back over that 6-foot fence. Thankfully, the dog had a flight reaction as well, and everything resolved nicely. But, just an instinctual flight reaction. So good way to stay alive and survive a threat or trauma. Third one I want to touch base on is the freeze. Hear that often, fight, flight, freeze. And what happens there? The freeze is usually a literal freeze, like shock, usually for a second or two while we're trying to figure out what to do next. And it's a good example where you are literally frozen and you cannot move if you want to. So I know for me, the freeze reaction is often to do with animals. I remember some time ago vacationing on Vancouver Island. My daughter and I went down to the river for a little dip in the river in the evening, and as we're coming up and over through the bushes, back to the cottage, as we come through the bushes, right there was nose to nose with a great big buck, a big deer. So the deer froze. My daughter and I froze. Then all 3 of us chose flight, and everything resolved nicely. So that's usually what we're doing with the freeze, momentary while we're trying to figure out what to do next. I think if it's extended, that's a little something else, and we'll touch base on that. Fourth one I put up there is what we call take cover, seek protection. Sort of self-explanatory, get something between you and the threat. The bear is charging down the path, get behind a tree, get behind a rock. A car is coming at you, hide behind a pole, get out of harm's way. When I was a young cop, boy, that fight was pretty cool. The older I get, I got to tell you, take cover, seek protection looks better and better all the time. As one of the 5, I highly recommend it if you have a choice. But it's a good example of this one, too, where it's involuntary. And my friend and colleagues lets me tell the story about her when she was scuba diving with her husband, who's an RCMP member, in Mexico or something, and she's out in front, he's a little behind, and having a lovely dive, and what does she see coming up from the depths but a big shark? Her immediate reaction, grab her husband's leg and push him in between her and the shark. So, she was, of course, mortified by what she'd done. If we asked her, she would certainly say, I would take a bite for my husband, right? Well, apparently not. So just a good example of an involuntary reaction. And the last one I want to touch on is what we call give up and check out. So sometimes it's about playing dead. Sometimes that's just about letting whatever's happening happen. So I know if I hear a survival reaction like this described to me, that things were bad. Basically, none of the other four was possible. I couldn't fight, couldn't get away. Essentially, I am frozen. There is no cover or protection. And basically, the safest way through this is just to let it happen. So often it's the give up, the let it happen, the play dead, and then the check out, or in psychology language, people dissociate. Sometimes they'll say, I was there, but I wasn't really there. So they'll have all the same physiological reactions, plus a lot of the endorphins and painkillers. But important to remember that this, too, is a way people survive threat or trauma. So which of these five is the best way to survive a traumatic event? Whichever one works. Whichever one works. They're all ways that we stay alive. But just as we know that in the moment there's involuntary reactions, we know that following a traumatic event, there's some predictable symptoms. So there's a lot of talk right now about PTSD, which I'm mostly happy about, but there's a lot of us that don't like the D in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. More and more what we're learning that PTSD is a normal reaction, and it results for some people in a physiological injury. Concrete, observable changes in the brain, in the gray matter, as well as in the body's chemicals. So just as in the moment we had an involuntary reaction, we know that sometimes after there's involuntary changes in the brain and the body. So more and more, I like the military's term operational stress injuries, appreciating that post-traumatic events are indeed an injury and not a disorder, as though there's something wrong with your thinking. And quickly, just to touch on some of those, we'll talk about them when the DSM would say that there's 4 key groups of symptoms that follow a traumatic event. The first one, numbing. You know, what is it that we want to numb? Thoughts, feelings, memories. Don't want to think about it, don't want to remember it, and I sure as heck don't want to feel the feelings. You know, and you know, what's the most common way for most first responders to numb after a traumatic event? Alcohol. Yes. Most research says across the board about 25% of first responders use or abuse alcohol to cope with the effects of the job. 70% of people with PTSD also have an addiction. So numbing is certainly a big one. But what almost concerns me more is those people, usually later in their career, not using alcohol or any substance, but they're just totally emotionally flat and vacant. It's like nothing moves them anymore. And that's the thing with this. It's not like you can go to work and be this sort of stone-cold, numbed-out person and then come home and be this loving spouse and parent and friend, right? When it gets shut down, it's shut down for good. The avoidance symptoms, avoiding anything that may trigger thought, feeling, memory. So sometimes that's a certain place. I don't want to drive by a certain intersection. I was assaulted in an elevator. I don't want to ride in elevators. And sometimes it could just be people, even friends, you know. How are you doing after that horrible assault? Well, thank you very much. I don't want to talk about it. So we end up avoiding, and then we get the hyperarousal or the hypervigilance. You know, and that's another big one for first responders. You know, it's like the fight or flight switch gets flicked on and it doesn't come off. You know, we're constantly scanning for a threat. You know, always looking for something that's going to harm us because we see it, you know, with nurses, medical professions, often it's health and safety threats. For police, it's bad guys. For fire, it's, you know, often intersections, driving, health concerns. So all those sorts of different threats, and it ends up leaving us exhausted when we're always on, can't relax, always on guard. It's one of the biggest challenges for first responders. And the fourth one is what we call the re-experiencing symptoms. When we're awake, that's intrusive images, intrusive nightmares. I'm not trying to think about them, but they're there. And at night, that's where we have the bad dreams or the nightmares. So it's a very difficult combination, and I said, how does it affect us? It disconnects us. It disconnects us from our own memories and past. I don't want to think and remember. It disconnects me from my own emotions and body I don't want to feel. And it certainly disconnects me from others when I'm numbed out, disconnected, and hypervigilant. So big effects of disconnection. And I like Judith Herman's quote. She's a famous Harvard psychiatrist, and she says that to study psychological trauma is to come face to face both with human vulnerability in the natural world and with the capacity for evil in human nature. And I'm always struck by her word evil in that quote because I think if such a thing exists, you folks are often the ones on the front line dealing with it. And she goes on to say that psychological trauma is an affliction of the powerless. When the force is that of nature, we speak of disasters. When the force is that of other human beings, we speak of atrocities. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. So in the moment, fear, helplessness, and horror, and what gets shattered is that sense of control, connection, and meaning. And I think that really gets well brought to the fore in what we call secondary trauma. And loosely described, secondary trauma is about the experience of confronting unfixable suffering. So whether that's coming upon a scene where someone's been assaulted or injured and their legs are broken and there's nothing I can do to fix that right now. You know, or in my world from policing, whether that's doing a next of kin notification and telling a parent that someone they love is never coming home again. Unfixable suffering. And when we're in a helping or protecting role and people are looking to us, do something, help me, keep me safe, heal me, protect me, and we can't, that leads to an experience that we call moral distress. And it's interesting, the research on moral distress started with the nurses in Vietnam, where they were at the MASH units, like the old 70s TV show, and the bodies are coming in, the injured are coming in, and as they do a tracheotomy, this side over here, the guy on the other side's bleeding out. If I stop the bleeding, this one chokes out. So how do the nurses cope? They shut down. Compassion fatigue, sort of that combination of prolonged exposure to unfixable suffering, moral distress, and burnout. Could talk more about that, but we'll just acknowledge that it has very similar symptoms to PTSD, but there's an excellent book by a woman named Ronnie Janoff Bowman, and she says that exposure to trauma and unfixable suffering changes how we see the world. It shatters our assumptions about the world. You know, we no longer see the people as good, you know, that the world isn't safe, there's no justice. People experience anger at the suspects, the bad guys for doing that, anger at the victims for putting themselves in harm's way, anger at the organization. If we had more staff on, we could have made this better. Apathy, mistrust. So because of our time, I'll have to move on. But this, in my experience, is the bigger risk for all first responders. Yes, we have those moments when we're the ones in harm's way, but the exposure, the chronic exposure to unfixable suffering is something I think we face every day. And it's not just the folks on the front line, whether that's our dispatchers, our communications operators, our stenographers who are typing out these horrible statements and 911 calls, ident people processing it, victim services workers, social workers dealing with the effects of this all the time. So this is a big, big risk for all first responders. Okay, so let's talk about quickly some of the research on trauma and PTSD before we get into the resilience piece. And just to say, I'm going to give you a few stats here on PTSD, but it's just important that you not take these lightly, okay? PTSD is a serious diagnosis. Numbing, avoidance, hyperarousal, re-experiencing. You're included in a clinical research study and fully diagnosed with this. It's serious. You know, we know that PTSD is life-limiting. PTSD is life-shortening. On average, people with PTSD live 15 years less than those without. And sadly, we know that in many cases, or at least in some cases, it can be life-ending. I know in Canada last year we had over 40 first responders took their own lives. Very, very sad and tragic. So important to understand the seriousness of these stats. So very little data on EMS, fire, corrections, and some of my stats are police-related, and it's not because I'm police-centric, it's because there's very little data out there, very little Canadian data. Corrections, 27%. A U.S. study. I understand our Corrections Canada Union here recently did a study where it was over 30. I want to get my hands on that. Fire, 7 to 30, depending on the study. Toronto, 16.5. ER medical staff, 22% partial, 7% full-blown PTSD. British EMS, 22% PTSD, 10% depression. High attrition rates, though. Lots of people with the paramedic service don't seem to last very long. And my anecdotal experience is it's the same in Canada. So I don't know if we have paramedics on the line, but it seems to be a fairly high turnover rate with the paramedics in my experience. Veterans, current stats, Iraq, Afghanistan, about 1 in 5 coming back. Police, 7 to 19%, with up to 1/3 with partial PTSD. So they may not meet all 4 diagnostic criteria, but you know, massive hypervigilance that gets in the way. Also important to notice rates of depression. We talk so much about PTSD, but you know, the most common diagnosis following a traumatic event is not PTSD, it's depression. So, you know, the general population, about 4% first responders, were at 5 times a greater risk for depression. And it's also important to remember in a good way when we talk about resilience here in a moment that, you know, people in the community can get PTSD from a single traumatic event, a bad car accident, assault, whatever it is. How many traumatic events are first responders exposed to throughout the course of a career? Sometimes I would say how many throughout the course of a shift, right? Dozens, if not hundreds for many of us out there. So given the amount of trauma exposure we have, we're an incredibly resilient bunch despite being at increased risk. Other stats, 92% of police no longer trust others. I personally think that stat's a bit low. 88% new prejudices on the job. That's an interesting one. Heartfelt, didn't have them coming in, got them now. Work changes us. Last couple things on stigma. I think it's hard to overcome. I think a big part of it is through education, normalizing the factors like I did today, normal, instinctual, and voluntary reactions in the moment, and then again, involuntary symptoms after the fact. The challenge with stigma is that we don't want to talk about it. You know, if we've been through something traumatic, I don't want to think, feel, remember, tell my story. It's upsetting. So even if someone's caring and open, I still don't want to talk about it. And people don't really want to hear about it. You know, I dealt with a military vet some time ago. It came back from the Medac pocket, some of Canada's heaviest combat. I remember him saying, you know, he'd go back to he was a reservist, went back to his regular job, and, oh, the guys would say, oh, yeah, did you kill anyone over there? And he's like, yeah, I did. A number of people at close quarters, would you like to hear about it? Total silence. So sometimes people may be caring or sometimes curious, but actually hearing the details of real intense trauma, people don't want to hear about that. And we fear showing weakness. You know, I feel shame. What's wrong with me? I've done this job for 12 years, never had a problem. What's happening? What's wrong? Worried that I'll be shunned if I come out. People aren't going to want to work with me. They're not going to trust me. You know, they're going to, you know, worry that I won't be able to do my job. I may lose an opportunity to go to a specialty section or get promoted. Same with us. We may, even if we're caring and open, fear others with PTSD. You know, are they going to be okay? Are they going to be there? Are they going to have our back? So even if we think they're good people and we support them, when it comes to the job, are they going to be there for us? So challenging to overcome the stigma, but I think certainly through the education, the normalization, efforts can be made. So let's wrap this time up here in our next bit to talk about resilience. You know, lots of research right now on resilience and some very proactive things that we can do to take care of ourselves. So on the personal end of things, key factors, by far the biggest factor in resilience, your level of social support, peer support, social support, friends, colleagues, family that got your back, that you can trust, and that you can talk to. This in the research is just showing that it's the biggest predictor of who's going to cope effectively with trauma and who's going to cope less effectively. We both go through something horrible after the event. I'm heading back to my basement suite to drink the night away. You're heading back to your family, your friends, where you just have some support and people that got your back. Way, way more effective means of coping. So this is why I'm such a big supporter of peer support programs. Because, you know, when you talk to first responders who've been through it, sometimes it's hard to go back and explain to our families what it was like to go to the scene of that teenage suicide or that horrible fatal. And we may not want to share that with our family and friends and re-traumatize them. But having a peer, someone who's been there, who gets it, who knows what it's like, that can just catch our story, normalize and validate things for us, very, very powerful. You know, it's great if our family does that, but when other peers that are in the field do it, big, big effects. Organizational support. I talked early on about all those organizational stressors, which I think are, you know, really take a toll. But when the organizational support's there, it makes a huge difference. And this doesn't always need to mean the fire chief or the chief paramedic or police chief making some huge policy change. This is stuff that we can do for one another. I remember as a young cop, I attended a sudden death. A teenager had suicided, and showing my age because it was in the very early 90s before cell phones were too popular. And as we're at the scene there, the mother comes home, and all the police, fire, ambulance all in the driveway, and runs up. And I remember my trainer putting his hands in the back panel of my vest and saying, "You're about to do your first NOK, next of kin notification," which I did. And I told her what happened. And I just remember that mom collapsing to the floor and making noises that I'd never heard another human being make. She sounded like a wounded animal. It was horrible, of course. And as I remember, as I was walking back to my police car a little while later, by that time my staff sergeant had showed up to the scene, a good, gruff old staff sergeant, and he just walked back beside me, and he just leaned over and just said to me, "That was a bad one." That's all he said, "That was a bad one." And then it was like, oh, I could breathe again. When that staff sergeant said that was a bad one, it wasn't just me, the young constable. When he said it was a bad one, it was like, okay. And we kind of got through it. Didn't cost him a dime, didn't take him 10 seconds. Just those things we can do for one another. Professional support. Look, I'm a bit biased because I'm in the field. Psychology works, counseling works. 80% of people that come in to see a psychologist get better. I can't erase your memories. I can't change what happened. We can help reduce a lot of those symptoms, a lot of the numbing, the avoidance, the re-experiencing, the hypervigilance, one of the harder ones to reduce, but possible. Sleep, one of the harder things to treat. But psychology works both in terms of symptom reduction, in terms of healthy coping, building resilience, and making sense of what it is that we've been through. So, you know, and access it early on. I find so many first responders, you know, they come in, it's like mid-career, you know, 15 years on the job and multiple traumas, spouse left me, dog died, kids hate me, just got done for impaired, thought I should come and see you, doc. And it's like, yeah, you think? Get in early. Find a good psychologist you trust, you respect, build that connection so as things come up, flush them out so you're not getting overwhelmed as your career progresses. Sleep. Look, this is another big one. It's one of the hardest trauma symptoms to treat, but here's what I would say, and I'm not a big believer in sleep medications, but if you're not sleeping for any time, go in and see a doc and get some help. You know, there's a big review into the interrogation techniques at Guantanamo Bay, and what were the two big torture techniques? Waterboarding and sleep deprivation. It's just going to amplify all your other symptoms, so it's something you really need to focus on. People that are resilient know how to make meaning of things. I'm not going to talk too much about this. They the other big key area that we're focusing on in terms of resilience right now is around mindfulness. So sometimes that can mean meditation or yoga, but mindfulness to me is about any activity that requires us to be fully present in the here and now, where I can't be ruminating about that jerk at work or some big court case coming up, but I have to be fully present in the here and now and connected to my body. So for me, I live in White Rock area in BC, so I've been out paddleboarding a little bit with my young daughter, and man, that paddleboarding looks easy, but when you're out there, those things are actually pretty tippy. So I have to be fully present, you know, aware of my balance, my body, my breath, all that kind of stuff, motorcycling, archery, music, martial arts, all those things. You know, I talked about how trauma makes physiological changes in the brain and the gray matter. Mindfulness is one of the only things that we're discovering that makes positive structural changes in the gray matter. So really, really powerful healing around mindfulness. So I can't recommend it enough. And then the last two things I'm going to talk about, and then I'll turn it over to questions here in a minute or two, is sort of personality factors. We talk about adaptability and optimism, so that we know that resilient people have an adaptable mindset. So, you know, I think it's the Marines, you know, adapt and overcome, adapt and overcome. So the crash happens, literal or metaphorical. Okay, this is bad. How are we going to move ahead? How are we going to redefine our lives? Not resilient people, it's crash, oh my God, kill me now. But that adapt, how do we move on? What supports can I access? How am I going to redefine this? That positive future focused mindset, very, very big predictor of resilience, as is optimism. And this is the thought that I'll leave you with is, I think so often our work, you know, we run the risk of seeing the worst that goes on in our communities. And it can leave us at times cynical and pessimistic and in dark places. But optimism is something that we can be mindful to cultivate in ourselves. So, you know, sometimes that's through consciously seeing the good that exists in the world. Sometimes it's through the practice of gratitude and appreciating the good things that come our way. And to me, optimism, it's not naive. It's about acknowledging and tolerating the trauma and the darkness that exists in the world without losing hope that much good still remains. And having that optimistic, positive future focus is one of the key ways that we can build our own resilience. And these are all things that we can cultivate in ourselves. So I had one more slide, but I'm aware of the time, so I think I'll leave it here and open the last few minutes to questions.
Awesome presentation, Jeff. I can't thank you enough for distilling all of that information into a very thoughtful and meaningful way. And I know, and certainly many on the line know, that it's hard to distill this information from, you know, the medical, psychological, pathology, all of these terms, and you've really translated it into real experiences. And thank you as well for sharing your experiences, Jeff. So before we go into the question and answer period, I realize that some of you may have to leave us, so please remember to fill out the post-webinar questionnaire. But also, if you do want to ask questions, if you don't see the chat feature, look for the icon on the upper right-hand corner of your screen that says chat. It looks like a little bubble. You can click on it, and then a chat window should appear for you on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint slides. So we encourage you, when you're sending your questions, to please let us, or please use the drop-down menu and select all panelists so that the questions go to myself and my colleagues, and then we'll answer questions on your behalf. And so we've had a few questions, Jeff, coming in. One question, and you spoke about adaptability, and I think this ties back to your different examples about the different types of responses that a person might either voluntarily or involuntarily exhibit following a traumatic event. So someone asked, if a person has a specific reaction during one traumatic event, will that always be the response following other traumatic events? And I thought that was a pretty good question, given that, you know, our baggage and likelihood of reacting to events likely varies from person to person, but I'll leave it to you, Jeff, to expand on that.
Yeah, I think that definitely we don't have the same reaction every time. That our reaction, whether it's fight, flee, freeze, whatever it is based on our perception of the events, and there's so many factors that go into that, whether that's our experience, for example, dealing with an aggressive dog. I suspect if there's some dog catchers on the line, that's probably something they're used to every day. For some of us, that would freak us out and cause a freeze or flight response. So I think some people sometimes have a bit of a go-to reaction where they're more apt to fight or flee or to freeze up, but it doesn't matter who you are, how much training you have, anybody can have any one of the 5 reactions in a moment.
That's great, and I assume, I guess, based on what you were presenting, Jeff, that there are ways to develop new habits so that you could better prepare to some of the traumatic events that you may face as a first responder?
For sure. I mean, it's a good question about how do we prepare for those things, and I think a lot of those resilience factors are things you can do ahead of time, developing the peer support, social support, the mindfulness-based activities. And there's some good research, I didn't have time to talk about that today, around stress inoculation training that's gone back many years, and resilience building through training people ahead of time. And I think that is a new area in the field, and there's some creative ideas and testing going on there. That said, as much as we can prepare and do everything ahead of time, if we're affected by something, we're affected. And again, you can have all the training, experience, be the biggest, toughest first responder out there, and if something's bad enough, you're going to be affected.
So important to note that, you know, regardless of where you think you might sit, it's important to have that self-awareness and ability to prepare, regardless of how prepared you might think you are. So another question from someone looking more specifically at stigma, and you touched upon it a great deal, I think, during the different themes that you brought out. What about stigma that may exist amongst peer supporters? And I realize that this is a bit specific, but I know that some first responders have previously shared that they feel that even within their peer support or CISM teams, there still sometimes is stigma based on personal experiences, or maybe it's an older generation that's part of that program. So any thoughts, I guess, or comments on how one might work to reducing stigma or encouraging positive attitudes amongst peer support members?
The short version is that I'd say, look, stigma is difficult to overcome 100%. I think you can begin by addressing it for a couple of the key ways. One is through education, and largely through normalizing the reactions and symptoms around traumatic events. So I think the education normalizing goes a long way. I think the other thing that really helps is when you have very credible people in your profession, senior respected people who are willing to come out and talk about what they've been through on the job and how something's affected them. I think that's a powerful, powerful model. I know when you've got a very senior military officer or cop or paramedic that's been on the job 20 years and they come out and talk about how they've been affected, it makes it very hard to argue with, and it makes it okay for others to acknowledge if they've been affected by a difficult event.
Those are great points, and it goes to speak, I think, to the complexity of the issue, and certainly peer support programs and crisis intervention support models, you know, vary greatly across the country, and there are different models to be followed. Specifically on peer support, for those that might have questions or be curious to find out more about training and support, the Mental Health Commission of Canada did release guidelines for the training and support of peer supporters. So please feel free to visit the Mental Health Commission of Canada's website, where you can find some more information. And there are some programs that are emerging out there that do train or deliver training for peer supporters, so you can always send us an email if you want more information on that. Now, Jeff, there's another question, I guess, or someone's asking if you could comment on, and this is more on the treatment and care aspect of things, but that's certainly where we're hearing a lot of the, I guess, uneasiness or some of the confusion out there is that there are all these great programs and treatments that we're starting to hear about, but how do you choose, you know, what's the most effective? So would you have, I guess, comments on effective treatments programs, more on the end of the spectrum of things, I guess?
And I guess this is what I'd say is, you know, there's a big discussion in the field of psychology right now around evidence-based therapies, you know, trauma treatments that are supported in the empirical research. And there's several of them out there largely based around cognitive behavioral treatments. But the thing that, so I strongly support all of them, the additional thing that's important to recognize, and even places like the U.S. National Center for PTSD, which drives much of this research, they would say evidence-based treatments, cognitive behavior, EMDR, prolonged exposure, all great, and we highly recommend them as a first course of treatment. But we know that they don't work for everybody, that they help, you know, somewhere between, you know, 1 to 2/3 of people, that there's medications that can help, and there's, quote, alternative therapies out there that help. So whether that's group-based interventions, equine therapies, PTSD service dogs, there's research right now using MDMA, ecstasy to treat trauma, or marijuana. So whatever your personal opinion on those is, just to say these are growing areas in the research. And even the U.S. National Center would say, look, find something that works, whether that's yoga, acupuncture, art therapy, music therapy. We support it all because no treatment works for everybody. So you kind of got to figure out what works for you. And the other big thing is finding a treatment provider, you know, if that's a psychologist or whoever that is, that you trust and respect and connect with. I'd be less concerned about their modality because the research would say that most trauma treatments are about the same in effectiveness, but finding someone you trust and connect with is probably the biggest factor.
That's a great, fulsome answer because you're right, it's so personal as well, and certainly I think the Mental Health Commission certainly shares the same perspective as well around making sure that you look into the evidence base of that treatment and care. So we're getting a lot of questions in, so I'm going to try to continue respecting and posing all the questions on behalf of participants. Now, I'm going to pretext this question by acknowledging with all the participants, reminding all the participants that mental illness and violence often is portrayed in a stigmatizing way. So in fact, those experiencing mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence themselves. But in this context, the question being asked is, why does it appear that some police officers might be engaged in maladaptive coping strategies when dealing with mental illness? So it might be violence, abuse. So I'm assuming, Jeff, that you can answer that from you know, a psychology perspective, but again, the context being that you know, some of the more violent situations, if you could expand on that.
So the question is why some police officers or other first responders engage in maladaptive coping?
Yeah.
Well, you know, that's a good question. And look, so I have two responses to that. I think, one, we know that exposure to trauma and unfixable suffering does cause those PTSD symptoms, the numbing, the avoidance, the hyperarousal, and often anger and, you know, substance use. And we do know that police are at increased risk for things like domestic violence and things like that. Why does that happen is a good question. I actually don't want to blame the PTSD for that because there's a lot of people with PTSD or schizophrenia, for that matter, who aren't violent towards others and suffer but do their best to find effective ways to do that. So I don't have a quick answer for you on that other than to say if and when those maladaptive strategies are identified, they need to be addressed quickly. And certainly the first responder needs to take the responsibility to say, hey, this isn't cool and I need to go and get some help and deal with that.
Well said. And I hope, I understood that it was a broad question from the participant that did ask, but if there are some specific questions you were hoping to get answered, please feel free to write back to us. From your experience, I guess, in the field of psychology, Jeff, what is a good source of information on new studies that might be emerging to PTSD and physical symptoms? And you mentioned also treatment. From your perspective, are there some good resources to recommend for participants to look at?
Two that I mentioned quickly. One, there's an excellent, very new book out written by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. And he's another Harvard psychiatrist who's been on the cutting edge of trauma treatment for several decades. And it was just out in 2016 or late 2015. Body Keeps a Score, Bessel van der Kolk. He does a fantastic job of integrating the very latest research, best practices. He talks about everything from medications and CBT through to yoga, mindfulness, and acupuncture. And where the field is going. The other resource would be the U.S. National Center for PTSD. You can go to their website. Their job is to disseminate research and best practices. They want it out there for free. So it's a great resource for research stats, best practices, treatment manuals, guidelines out there. They've got excellent stuff at no cost.
Excellent. And I know that my colleague may have posted this earlier, but in Canada, certainly as awareness and acknowledgement of PTSD is increasing, there is a new website that was launched maybe just half a year ago called firstrespondersfirst.ca. And so there might not be as much information as you're hoping for on the treatment side of things, but certainly from an organizational perspective, there's a great amount of information in terms of how one might develop a PTSD prevention plan. And so please feel free to take a look at that as well. There's another question that I'll actually answer myself, but maybe you can expand on, Jeff. Someone was asking about the ability to build resilience and prepare mentally individuals that might be coming into the workplace so that they can be mentally prepared for facing trauma even before they might face trauma. And that's actually an area that the Mental Health Commission of Canada had a great deal of interest when it started out in 2007. So the Mental Health Commission started a program called Opening Minds, which did a scan and studied many stigma and resiliency building programs across Canada, and eventually landed on a great tool that was developed by the Department of National Defense called Road to Mental Readiness. So this program is actually just that, to build resilience, to build mental readiness, and to reduce stigma. So you can read more information about that on the Mental Health Commission of Canada's website, but that program has been adopted or adapted rather for first responders, including police, fire, paramedics, dispatchers. I believe there's one being finalized for corrections. And then, of course, there's a number of other great tools that are starting to surface across Canada, so I'd encourage you to take a look at what's available in your community. So, Jeff, I guess from your side, any other tools or programs specifically on building mental readiness that you might be aware of?
No, I think what you mentioned there is great. I think educating first responders sort of before they go into the field, good. The only other thing that I would add, I think it's also good to educate their family members, you know, to sort of notice what maybe they can expect and to pay attention to any changes in their loved one throughout the course of a career. I find often it's, you know, as first responders, we're sort of like the frog in the pot as the water begins to boil and we're not aware of the changes in us. So often it's our family or friends that notice that. So asking for that feedback and paying attention is also really important.
That's such a great point. I've heard something like, you know, family, friends, and colleagues are often the first responders, the front line of first responders themselves. They're the first ones that are going to start noticing the change and symptoms. So you're right that it's important for us and organizations to think about how they can share that same information with family and friends and loved ones. Some more questions that are coming in. I guess we know that there are different types of debriefing and peer support programs, and we spoke a little bit about peer support. In your experience, I guess, could you expand on how an organization might go to select a critical incident stress management program? And one that was cited as an example is the one with the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, so ICISF. So any thoughts, I guess, or guidance to give organizations that would be looking to implement such a program?
Look, we could have a whole session on the debate around critical incident stress debriefings.
Indeed.
This is what I would quickly say on that. Look, I think there's some legitimate criticisms. They say, you know, that critical incident stress debriefings, the ICISF model, doesn't prevent PTSD and it can do harm. I tend to agree with those criticisms that, especially if they're not well planned and screened and it's not a homogeneous group, they can do some harm, and that they don't prevent PTSD. I am a big supporter of the ICISF model and CISDs because I think, one, if they're properly screened and planned and voluntary in a homogeneous group, first responders typically like them. They report well on them. In my experience, rarely is there any harm done. And I don't think they're designed to prevent PTSD, but it is a really effective way to both debrief and connect after an event. So you sort of catch my bias there. I guess what I would say, though, is, you know, all the debate out there, do some research yourself. Find the model that works for your organization, and then evaluate it. You know, follow up. If you choose to adopt the ICISF model, great, but make sure you follow up. Is this working? What are people saying? Is it being helpful? Are there any concerns being expressed? Or whether you choose the psychological first aid approach or whatever else. I guess that's the short version, is make sure you evaluate it. Do your research and then evaluate it to see if it's working.
I really appreciate the way you answered that, Jeff, because it is a tough question, but that's really what we're encouraging folks out there to think about, is that regardless of what program or tool you're using, you need to be thinking about the results and whether it's meeting your objectives. So looking at evaluation, as you mentioned, and certainly what we're hearing, at least from the research community, is that there is a need to do further research and evaluation in peer support and CISM models, but for the time being, we hear anecdotally that it works, and it's been such a great asset for organizations that are using them. So I guess to your suggestion, Jeff, the recommendation or the comment or advice being provided is to make sure that you're evaluating and meeting your objectives. So I guess that really concludes the question and answer period for us, given that we seem to have had a really engaging conversation. I feel like we've covered all of the topics, the hot topics really, when we're talking about resilience and trauma. And Jeff, again, you've done such a fantastic job at distilling this into an easy way to understand, practical, including, you know, some real life examples and, you know, some more light humor, including the use of Taylor Swift songs. I was chuckling in the background on mute, Jeff, but I appreciated that you even remembered the right artist, so well done. So I guess as we leave you, I just wanted to thank you, Jeff, for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom with everyone across the country. Thank you, dear participants, as well, for joining us and creating this safe space. And please do take the time to fill out the short post-webinar questionnaire. Again, it's important for us to know whether we're meeting the needs or if we need to tailor things differently. And if you feel that this conversation, again, has left you unsettled, please do feel free to reach out to a friend or colleague, or if you're in crisis, to call 911 or your local emergency department. So again, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. On behalf of all of us here at the Mental Health Commission Canada, thank you again for joining us, and be well.
Thank you.